Test, test, test. Okay.
Look,
Okay. Yep.
Okay,
Good.
Then when we switch to, we're still using the regular mic, and we'll go this one on.
Yes.
Okay, I just wanna
Yep.
make sure.
Yep. Okay. I'm coming through. Am I coming through now? Again? Okay. Perfect. All right. Forgive me. We've got new streaming stuff going on, and it's already been a morning. Okay. Let me get. Where's my phone? Okay. It's not turned on silent, so that could be a problem. Okay, you said we're in Psalm 8. Okay, we're going to continue to begin by praying through the Psalms. So let's do Psalm 8 as we get started. O Lord, our sovereign, how majestic is your name in all the earth. You have set your glory above the heavens. Out of the mouths of babes and infants you have founded a bulwark because of your foes, to silence the enemy and the avenger. When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars that you have established, what are human beings that you are mindful of them? Mortals, that you care for them. Yet you have made them a little lower than God, and crowned them with glory and honor. You have given them dominion over the works of your hands. You have put all things under their feet, all sheep and oxen, and also the beasts of the field, the birds of the air, and the fish of the sea, whatever passes along the paths of the sea. O Lord, our sovereign, how majestic is your name in all the earth. Lord, we pray that your Spirit will be with us this morning as we study your word. It's in your Son's name that we pray. Amen. I find it fascinating. Okay, so I don't know if I've said this to you before. So I put together sermon calendars for what I preach, and my sermon calendars stay at least 6 months, sometimes a year and a half ahead of where we actually are. So I know for the most part what I'm doing through all of next year. I've known for a while, at least generically. And when I have weeks that I'm not preaching on Sundays, I go and kind of harden those plans, solidify exactly what we're going to be doing in this generic area that I know I'm going to be preaching on. And it's been interesting to me that I found, because I know some people that say that the Spirit, that's limiting the Spirit, not letting him work week to week, things that are going on in my life, things that are going on in the lives of people, things that are going on in the lives of the church. You don't have the ability to make changes and stuff to kind of let the Spirit guide what you're preaching. I strongly disagree with that. I plan into my schedules when things do need to be changed, because sometimes that happens. Sometimes I need to do something different than what was planned. But interestingly, I have found consistently that when something comes up and I'm thinking we need to talk about this, that it was already there in the schedule. That the Spirit was working when I was putting together my sermon schedule. I believe the Spirit can work in preparation just as much as he can in spur of the moment stuff. And I say that because we started reading the Psalms because one day I just woke up one Sunday morning and said, you know what would be a good idea? Let's start praying through the Psalms. We started that 8 weeks ago. To get us to Psalm 8, today, as we start speaking about the meaning of Jesus being the Son of Man, Psalm 8 uses the phrase Son of Man. In verse 4, what are human beings that you are mindful of them, the Son of Man that you care for them? Psalm 8 is one of the passages that we're actually going to be talking about today. Not only that, but Psalm 8 connects with what we're talking about on Sunday morning. Talking about heaven, talking about our role as human beings. So David here talks about the sovereignty of God. And in essence, what he's saying is he looks at the heavens, he looks at the earth, he looks at all these things that God has created. And he's just blown away with the power of God to create all these things. But more than that, he's blown away that out of all of these things, God would care about human beings. You look out into space, for example, and we look very small. And that's kind of what David's doing. He's looking out at God's creation, and he realizes we as human beings seem very small, but yet, God, you seem to care about us. And then he moves on to say, not only that, but you have given us, in verse 6, dominion over the works of your hands. That's a reference back to us being created in the image of God that we've been talking about a lot on Sunday morning. God creates human beings in his image, and then he says, what? Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and over everything that creeps on the earth, the exact language that David uses here. So he says, it not only amazes me that out of all these things that God would care about human beings, but that God would put human beings over his creation. That the intention of us as human beings is actually to rule and to run God's creation. You could think about maybe even the creation like being God's business, and he's hired us as the CEOs. Human beings are the CEOs meant to actually run the business, to run God's creation. So I say all that to say it amazes me the way that the Spirit works in ways that we can't always see. And I saw that this morning, thinking that the Spirit somehow guided us to Psalm 8 the exact week that we needed to pray through Psalm 8. With that being said, we're going to move into what we're actually going to be talking about. Last week, I kind of introduced us to this series that we're going to be doing called Who is Jesus? And the points that I made last week is that we tend to form Jesus in our image. Right? We make Jesus look like us. And when we make Jesus look like us, a lot of the times Jesus ends up supporting the things that we support, approving the things that we approve, disapproving of the things that we disapprove of. Jesus ends up just being another form of us. And I mentioned that sometimes that's not always a bad thing because Jesus has a meaning for everybody. But that a lot of the times in the West, we have made Jesus into a white male, which then he doesn't connect with people of other areas of the world. I talked about Asian Jesus. I talked about kind of Latin American Jesus, how Jesus connects to people in other areas of the world, because it looks different. It looks different to follow Jesus in Latin America or in Asia or in Africa than it looks like to follow Jesus in the United States. It looks a bit different because it's a different culture. It's different people. They have different things going on. They have different stresses. They have different things that vie for their attention than we do. So it looks a little bit different. And so one of the problems with making Jesus in our image is that as well, he becomes unrecognizable sometimes in other cultures to other people that are different than us. And so we have to be willing to allow Jesus to mean something to everyone, to mean something in every culture, because I think that he does. But more importantly than that, we talked about how Jesus wasn't a 21st century anybody. He wasn't a 21st century American. He wasn't a 21st century man who lived in Asia or in Latin America or in Africa. He was a first century Jewish man. And so what we're going to try to do is we're going to try to understand Jesus in his historic context, understand who Jesus was as a 21st century, as a first century Jewish man, because I think from that we can then move forward and ask, okay, what does Jesus look like? What does it mean to follow Jesus in the 21st century in these different areas? What does it mean for a man to follow Jesus? What does it mean for a woman to follow Jesus? What does it mean for someone in America to follow Jesus? What does it mean for someone in Asia or in Africa or in Latin American to follow this Jesus that we've now defined in Jesus terms? If that makes sense. And as a first century Jewish man. And the way that we're going to go about doing that is to look at some of the names for Jesus, some of the things that Jesus is called throughout Scripture, and what they meant in the first century, what they meant to Jesus, what they meant to his hearers, what they meant to his fellow Jews, for Jesus to be called these things. And so we're going to start today with the phrase Son of Man. Cherie, could you do me a favor? There are Son of Man handouts on, does anyone need one? How many do we need? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5-ish. I forgot to bring those in here. Cherie will be back with some Son of Man handouts. I think it will be easier for you to kind of follow along with what we're talking about, to have the information in front of you. What we're going to do as we move through talking about what it means for Jesus to be Son of Man is, as my notes aren't completed, so as I complete my notes, I'll continue to give you additional pages that you can kind of keep together with this first page. So, with that being said, throughout the New Testament, Jesus is called the Son of Man. When you hear that phrase, Son of Man, what comes to your mind? If you're reading the Gospels, Jesus is called Son of Man. What do you think that means? Say that again? Son of Joseph, right? He's a human being. He's the son of Mary and Joseph. Does anything else come to your mind when you think of Jesus being the Son of Man? A leader. He's come to, in many ways, I think you could talk about Jesus coming to lead people, right? What else? Son of Man. He's a servant. Jesus said, I came not to be served, but to serve. And to give his life as a ransom for many. I think of the scene where Jesus washes the feet of his disciples at the Last Supper in John's Gospel. I think that's a prime image of Jesus, his servant. Right? Anything else come to your mind when you think of Jesus as Son of Man? Oh, don't cheat. Son of Man, the first thing that I have here is the usage of the Son of Man. The Son of Man is used 86 times in the New Testament. It's used 69 times in the Synoptics, that's Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's used 13 times in John. It's only used 4 times outside of the Gospels. It is never used as a confessional statement in the early church. What do I mean by confessional statement? Well, a confessional statement is when people confess that they believe something about Jesus, right? So a confessional statement would be things like, I believe Jesus is the Messiah, right? That's an important confession for Christians to make. I believe Jesus is the Messiah. Or I believe Jesus is the Son of God, right? What do we ask people to confess before they're baptized? That they believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. So you have those kinds of confessional statements, that we are confessing belief. And when we confess those beliefs, that generally causes us to do something, right? If we confess Jesus as Messiah, Jesus as Son of God, that also means we follow Jesus as Messiah and as Son of God, right? That means that we're going to be obedient to him. We're going to try to model our lives after him, so on and so forth, right? Does that make sense? What's all wrapped up in a confessional statement about Jesus. Son of Man is never used like that in the Bible. Nobody ever confesses to believe that Jesus is the Son of Man. That never occurs. As I mentioned, it's used almost exclusively in the Gospels. And in the Gospels, Jesus is the only one that ever says it. Nobody else in the Gospel ever calls Jesus Son of Man. Jesus only ever calls himself Son of Man. The one exception is John 12:34, where other people are quoting Jesus. Or you have other people saying, well, Jesus calls himself the Son of Man. They aren't calling him Son of Man. They're saying Jesus calls himself Son of Man. And I don't know about you, but that's fascinating to me, that you have this phrase, Son of Man, that Jesus uses 69 times in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, 13 times in John. Jesus says this phrase, but nobody else ever says it. Nobody else ever calls Jesus Son of Man. And Son of Man is Jesus' preferred way to refer to himself. If you read through the Gospels, very rarely does Jesus call himself by another name. He almost always calls himself Son of Man, particularly in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's a little bit different in John. John's doing something very different than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. That's a discussion for another day. But the reason that I wanted to start with understanding who Jesus is as the Son of Man is because that's what Jesus called himself. I think it's a good place to start with the phrase that Jesus preferred. Jesus loved to call himself the Son of Man. Seems like a all right place for us to start. And, well, how did Jesus understand himself as the Son of Man? What was Jesus thinking? What did he want the people following him, his disciples, the crowds? What did the gospel writers want the early Christians to understand about Jesus through this phrase, Son of Man? The four other locations that the Son of Man is used are not, they're indirectly referring to Jesus, but not directly. Acts 7, Stephen, when he gives his speech and then he's stoned, you may remember he sees into heaven, and he says, I see one like a Son of Man. That is a reference to Jesus, but it's an indirect reference to Jesus. Stephen is still not calling Jesus or confessing Jesus as Son of Man. He's saying, in heaven, I see a human being next to the throne of God. That's an interesting thing that we're going to get to. What does it mean? How do we connect those ideas of being created in his image? Because we are. And then Jesus comes in that image, right? But yeah, so Stephen sees into heaven. He sees a human being there with God. Hebrews 2:6, we have it, but it's a quote of Psalm 8. So the Hebrew writer isn't actually using it. He's quoting something else. And in Revelation 1 and Revelation 14, you have this one like a Son of Man as well. Again, referring to Jesus, but indirectly, right? It's not Jesus, especially in Revelation, it's all figurative language, right? You know, Satan's a dragon, and you've got these other beasts and stuff like that. So twice Jesus is the Son of Man, but again, indirectly. Any thoughts come to your mind about any of that?
Yes, when he looked at Stephen before yet John looked at heaven, he said, I see human beings and Son of Man. It made me realize that, all of my life I'm thinking that my body stays here, but my soul, my spirit goes into heaven, but yet it could still be recognized as a human being.
Yeah, I read, the goal of Christianity is to look like Jesus. It's to be resurrected, right? We've talked. It's not to go to heaven. Heaven is the prize upon reaching the goal, but it's not the goal. The goal is to look like Jesus. Ultimately, it's to be resurrected like Jesus, right? I read this wonderful tweet yesterday. This guy was talking about how the Bible talks about Christians dying and going to be with Christ or going to be with God, right? We talked about that when we were talking about where we go when we die. The Bible talks about that happening, but the Bible refers to that as death, right? You die and you go to be with Christ, right? And yet Scripture looks forward to resurrection, something beyond death. And the point that he was making is that we've made the goal of Christianity going to be with God. And he said, in turn, we've made the goal of Christianity to die, not to be resurrected. The goal of Christianity is not to die, but it's the hope of resurrection beyond death. Last week, we talked a little bit about how Jesus was resurrected. He has this body. It's different, right? He appears in rooms. He walks through walls. He does all kinds of weird stuff. But it's still a physical body, right? You can look at it and still say, hey, that's Jesus. He eats, right? He eats fish on the seashore with his disciples. So there's some kind of physicality to it. I talked about last week when Jesus ascended to heaven, the historical Christian belief is that all of him, including that body, went into heaven. And that's what I think Stephen is seeing there, is that Jesus in his resurrected body. I said Jesus' body isn't like some capsule when a rocket is launched by NASA into space where you just kind of discard it into the ocean. Jesus didn't start ascending and just discard his body into the ocean. Jesus' body got assumed into God. And what that means is you have human beings that actually become a part of the very essence of God. And for human beings to become a part of the very essence of God is how God saves us. God takes humanity in its brokenness, in its ugliness, and assumes it into himself in order to save us. If that didn't happen, if Jesus' body is discarded somewhere along the way, then we're not saved. Salvation can't happen because humanity is still separated from God. But for Jesus, in his resurrected body, to be assumed into God is for God to bring humanity into himself in order to save humanity. That's why Jesus became a human being. I'm not sure if I've said this before, but Jesus talks about how God is spirit. John 4, God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and truth. Right? A spirit can save a spirit. In other words, if the only part of us that's saved is some spiritual part, if there's no resurrection, if our bodies aren't a part of it, if there's none of that, then Jesus didn't need to become human. He didn't need to die on the cross. He didn't need to shed any blood. That's not necessary. God is spirit. A spirit can save a spirit. But God's not trying to save a spirit. God's trying to save a human. He's trying to save us. And we're made up of much more than spirit. We are made up of body. We are made up of soul/spirit. We're also made up of mind. We have this ability to think. We have this ability to reason that other animals, other beings do not have. We are holistic people, made up equally of body and of soul and of spirit. And so for God to save all of us, God had to become like all of us. He had to become a human being. God's spirit had to unite with a human spirit. It had to take on a human body. It had to take on a human mind to save human beings, right? And that, as Tom pointed out, I think that's what Stephen is seeing. He looks up into heaven, and it's the same thing in Revelation. You have this human being that's there in heaven. That's resurrected Jesus, bringing humanity into the presence of God in order to save humanity. Any thoughts, questions, comments? Thank you. Concerns, criticisms, rebuttals? Okay, so with that being said, I want to move on to the linguistic meaning of Son of Man. In other words, what do the words, what does the phrase Son of Man mean? Son of Man in Aramaic, you're probably not familiar with Aramaic. Aramaic is a Semitic language like Hebrew. Aramaic probably came about through Hebrew mixing with other languages. So you think about, you have the nation of Israel that spoke Hebrew, which is a Semitic language, and you had other nations around Israel that also spoke Semitic languages, but different, right? You can even think about English. There's different forms of English, right? Even in the United States, you go to different parts of the United States, there's different kinds of English. You go to Europe, as they would say, you hop across the pond, and the language changes. It's still English, right? You go to England, it's still English. It's a very different type of English sometimes. So you can think about it maybe in that way. And so the Hebrew people, the Israelites, begin to interact with these other civilizations, right? They're going to war with them. They're trading with them. They're creating alliances with them. They're being diplomatic with them. And so through that, it seems, you get this kind of hybrid language. That's Hebrew mixed with some other Semitic languages, and it becomes Aramaic. Particularly when the southern kingdom of Judah goes into captivity in Babylon, they're now in Babylon. Babylon is speaking a Semitic language, but they're not speaking Hebrew. And so you have these captives who have to learn how to speak and to live in Babylon. And you get the rise, especially there, of this kind of hybrid language. By the time you get to the first century, most Jews don't speak Hebrew anymore. But they do speak Aramaic. If you were to go into the synagogue in the first century, the rabbi would stand up and he would read the Torah from Hebrew. But then he would summarize it or paraphrase it in Aramaic, because most of the people in the synagogues would not have understood the Hebrew reading. But they still read it in Hebrew because they believed that's the original language. It's the right language in their mind. So we read it in Hebrew, but nobody understands it. So we have to paraphrase it now in Aramaic. With that being said, a Jewish man like Jesus in the first century would not have known how to speak Hebrew. His parents wouldn't have known how to speak Hebrew. His siblings wouldn't have known how to speak Hebrew. His disciples wouldn't have known how to speak Hebrew. The crowds he was preaching to would not have known how to speak Hebrew. Jesus probably did not know how to speak Hebrew. He probably spoke Aramaic. At minimum, he did most of his teaching in Aramaic because the people that he was teaching didn't know Hebrew. And I say that to say, when Jesus says, "I am the Son of Man," historically he was saying that in Aramaic. I don't know if this messes you up, but that makes our English translations a translation of a translation. The original Greek Gospels are a translation of Jesus' Aramaic words. Jesus spoke in Aramaic. The Gospels were then written in Greek, and then we translate the Greek into English. Not that anybody cares about this. You can actually go into the Greek and you can find Aramaic phrases. Like, you can see how the Greek's kind of cluttered. It doesn't quite make sense, and you can tell that's because there wasn't an easy way to translate the Aramaic original. They kind of had to do their best. So you can actually trace back and get some of the original Aramaic phrases of Jesus. This may not interest you either, but I'm going to say it anyways. In Romans and in Galatians, Paul says that in Jesus we become sons of God. It's important that we are sons of God and not children of God. I love Bibles with gender-inclusive language, but we mess it up a little bit there. Because only sons got to receive inheritance. And that's Paul's point in Galatians and Romans, that not just men, not just Jewish men, and not just the eldest son of a Jewish man get to receive inheritance, but all people, Jew and Gentile, male and female, slave and free, get to receive inheritance. So we become sons of God. That is, we get to receive inheritance from God. That doesn't diminish gender or anything like that, but the point there is inheritance. We all get to receive inheritance. But Paul says that in Jesus, in Romans 8, it's through the power of the Spirit, we become sons of God. We get to receive inheritance. Our inheritance is resurrection from the dead. Paul says that we know that we receive an inheritance because we, like Jesus, can cry out, Abba, Father. And in the way that works is Abba is the Aramaic word for father. And then you have pater, the Greek word for father. So when Paul's writing there, he says we get to cry out Abba, Pater, Father, Father. But Aramaic and Greek. Why does Paul do that? Well, Paul speaks Greek. His audience speaks Greek. They say pater. They say father. But when Jesus talked about his father, when Jesus said, pray like this, our Father, Jesus said, Abba. That's how Jesus talked about God in Aramaic. Paul puts those together, Abba, Father, 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 to say, in essence, we get to use the same words that Jesus used. That God is our Father in the same way that God was Jesus' Father. That in Jesus we have the exact same father-child relationship with God. It's a long way to say Jesus spoke Aramaic. My point is, Jesus spoke Aramaic, and in Aramaic the phrase Son of Man is not a title, but it's an idiom. In the most basic sense, Son of Man simply means a human being. You go back to Hebrew, so the phrase Son of Man shows up throughout the Old Testament. And that's where Jesus takes it from. It's not, this phrase isn't something new, but it's rooted in Judaism. Right? Remember, Jesus is a first century Jew. Who are Jesus' followers? Well, his disciples are Jews. Who are the crowds that are flocking around Jesus? They're all Jews. They understood this phrase, Son of Man, right? Because it's found throughout the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, the phrase, Son of Man, is Bat Adam. Son of Adam is a literal way that you could translate that. The Hebrew word Adam is both the name Adam and it's the generic word for man or for human being. In Genesis 1 and 2, you're not going to care about this anyway either, but here we go. Genesis 1 and 2, there's huge scholarly debate about when the word Adam transfers from the generic word man to the proper name Adam, because it's unclear. Because it's used all throughout the first chapters of Genesis. And at the beginning, it's just man. God creates man. And then the word man becomes a proper name, Adam. It's the same word. And the reason that Adam is called Adam, the generic term for human being, is because Adam and Eve are meant to be prototypes for humanity. Right? We are meant to look at Adam and Eve and say, that's God's intention for humanity, for human beings. It's not God's intention for one man and one woman. This was God's intention for the entire human race. And so Adam is called human being. That's what his name means. And so Son of Man is son of Adam. It is son of man. It is son of human being. It is son of Adam. It is simply a human being. Sometimes it can be used to talk about humankind in general, right? We are all sons of Adams. We are all human beings, right? We all have a father. That's the way that procreation works, right? Everyone has to have a father and a mother. We are all human beings. Sometimes the phrase can be used to talk about a restricted group. So sometimes it can be used to refer to everyone. Sometimes it can be used to refer to some human beings. Sometimes it can be used of an individual human, someone, that person, which is the way that Jesus uses it, right? He says, I am the Son of Man. Me as an individual, I'm referring to as a human being, but a special kind of human being. We'll talk about that kind of as we move through. Questions, comments? Interesting.
And I don't know whether that comes from the French language that they were requiring them to learn. Every one of them, some of them have lost their code of their art, but most of the other ones can speak Asian French. But that's what they call it, a dog.
Which,
And it's weird.
yeah. Like I said, that's technically the correct Hebrew pronunciation.
See, and
Uh,
I'm from over around there, French, Asian French.
But that's also a good point going back to the way that there's different ways to speak the same language, right? And so we can kind of understand how, something like Aramaic comes about because there's multiple ways to. So I want to end on this. I kind of want to prove my point that Son of Man in Aramaic and in Hebrew simply means human being. So I'm going to read it. It shows up throughout the Old Testament. I don't remember off the top of my head how many times it shows up in the Old Testament. But I want to read a couple of examples of the use of Son of Man in the Old Testament. It's used in Psalm 8:4, which is the psalm that we prayed through to begin service, which says, "What is man that you are mindful of him, and the Son of Man that you care for him?" The way that Hebrew poetry works is you have parallel lines that different words, but they mean the same thing. So line 1, "What is man," is synonymous with Son of Man. They're synonyms. That you are mindful of him is synonymous with care for him. So you see how it's saying the same thing, just in different words. So you have these parallel lines. So Son of Man is equal to man. We're just talking about human beings, right? We talked about how the point of David here in Psalm 8 is that God, despite his majesty, right, still cares about human beings. And so the use here is just everyone, human beings in general, not anyone specifically, but God cares about everyone. You get something similar in Psalm 80. And you have parallel lines here. "But let your hand be on the man of your right hand, the Son of Man whom you have made strong for yourself." So here, it's interesting. It seems like the author isn't talking about all people. He's talking about maybe one person, maybe even a group of people, but it's still used generically as people, right? You can see the parallel structure. The man at your right hand, for someone to be at the right hand of God or the right hand of the king, is someone who is made strong, someone who's God's representative, someone who's second in charge. But you have this man, which is then paralleled, Son of Man. And then you have it in Ezekiel. I put here Ezekiel 2 and verse 1. If you go through and you read through Ezekiel, Son of Man shows up most often in Ezekiel. And it's the way that God talks to Ezekiel. God begins to talk to Ezekiel, and he calls Ezekiel Son of Man. So in Psalm 8, it's all human beings. In Psalm 80, it's a specific group of human beings. In Ezekiel, it's one human being in Ezekiel. God's doing something special through Ezekiel, but Ezekiel's still just a human being. Right? There's something special about him, but he's just human. And you can read through all the cases in the Old Testament, that's the way that it's used. So Son of Man simply means human being. And as we're going to see when we get into the Gospels and see the way that Jesus uses it, sometimes Jesus uses it just to say, I am a human being. I think sometimes Jesus uses it to say, this is true of all human beings, by calling himself, saying it's true of me, therefore it's true of all human beings. Sometimes Jesus uses it to say, I'm just a special human being, kind of like Ezekiel, kind of like a prophet. But sometimes Jesus uses it in the way that it's used in Daniel chapter 7, which is more of a kingly, godly use of Son of Man. We'll go into Daniel 7 next week. Questions, comments, concerns? All right, that's where I technically ended on time. So we're going to end there. We will get into Daniel chapter 7 next week.